In her book, Atlas of the Heart, Brené Brown uses the German word Freudenfreude to describe the feeling of enjoying the success of another person in much the same way that we cheer on athletes in the Olympics. This word is very similar to the Greek word for rejoice, shucharo, which means to celebrate God's grace together as we share in someone else's joy. Since I clearly don't speak German or Greek, and probably butchered both of those words, I love that Brown's researchers coined another term for this experience. Their choice, shoy, is not only much easier to pronounce, I love the way it smooshes together share and joy. As I reflected this week on things that inspire wonder, awe, and joy in my heart, things that I shoy, I thought about my recent visit to see Shayna, Scott, and Layla. Many of you know Shayna and Scott, and a few of you have had the privilege of meeting their adorable daughter, Layla. When I visited them a few weeks ago for the first time in many months, I just couldn't get myself to leave. I was so in love, not only with little Layla, with her huge eyes and those chipmunk cheeks that are topped only in beauty and charm by her flirtatious manner, but also by the amazing history of how this beautiful family came to be. And so this morning, with Shayna and Scott's permission, I want to share a bit of their story. Some of you may remember that we shared in the excitement of this couple just about 2 years ago as they anticipated an adoption. But then the most devastating thing happened. The expectant mom, who had selected them to adopt her child, stopped communicating with both them and the adoption agency just weeks before the baby was to be born. Apparently, she changed her mind and chose to keep her baby, perhaps a good thing for her and the child, but a decision that caused deep pain for Scott and Shayna. Fast forward nearly a year, and the agency again contacted Shayna and Scott about a mom who wanted to meet them as potential parents for her unborn child. With a fair amount of hesitancy, they agreed to a meeting and began a conversation about a possible adoption. Thus began a most amazing series of events. While Scott and Shayna were away visiting family over the Christmas holiday last year, they received a call from Mom asking if they might have any ideas to help her. Because as someone who travels for her work 50 weeks of the year, she returned to Cleveland just days before Christmas, 8 months, 8 months pregnant, with no family in the area and nowhere to go. Without hesitating, when they took the phone call, Shayna and Scott told the woman the entry code to their house and invited her to stay in their home until the baby came. Then they hung up the phone and realized what they had just done. They invited a stranger that they had only met one time to enter their home while they were away and allowed her to have free rein for several days until they returned. But they stood by their decision, and when they came home, they found everything in order and a very pregnant woman curled up on the couch watching TV. Over the next several days, they had a chance to get to know one another until on January 2nd, their new friend woke up early in the morning in labor, and the baby was coming fast. Scott barely had time to get her to the hospital before beautiful little Layla was born. both mom and baby were in great health and were able to return home after just a couple of days. And then the part of the story about which I remain in awe nearly a full year later began. Living together, the three parents took loving care of Layla for the first weeks of her life. But her biological mother was clear. As someone who traveled so much and didn't have a strong support network, she could not take proper care of a baby, and she wanted Shayna and Scott to adopt Layla. A few weeks passed that included visits from Layla's biological father, who also, while excited to meet her, felt he was not in a position to be a full-time father. By the end of January, Layla's biological mother found a place nearby and moved out. Over the course of the last year, both genetic parents see Layla regularly, but are very clear that her parents are Scott and Shayna. When I recently visited, I was overwhelmed by the love that fills every corner of their beautiful home. It is evident that Layla is adored by her parents, and they are so gracious and certain about wanting her to know her biological family. This unusual but marvelous family inspires me and fills me with awe and so very much joy. For Scott, for Shayna, for Layla, and for the two people I have never met, whose willingness to do the best for their child enabled them to make a generous and amazing decision. Reflecting again on our gospel reading, I love that Elizabeth's family and neighbors experienced the same joy I felt when visiting Scott, Shayna, and Layla. And 8 days after giving birth, the same feeling of rejoicing returned when Elizabeth announced that, breaking with tradition of giving her son his father's name, the baby's name would be called John. Stunned by this choice, the anxious crowd turned to Zechariah, but he echoed his wife's desire. With that, Zechariah's voice returned, and everyone was filled with awe as they praised God. It's interesting to me that awe and wonder elicit the same feelings of praise today as they did 2 millennia ago. Datcher Keltner, a psychologist at the University of California, Berkeley, notes that awe is a feeling of being in the presence of something vast that transcends our understanding of the world. But, he observes, awe is also simpler than we think. It's accessible to everyone and can be found both in dramatic, life-changing events, but also in the mundane occurrences of everyday life. As a pragmatist and someone who's often hurrying from one thing to the next, I am deeply grateful to be married to a scientist who is always full of wonder. One night this week, as we arrived home after dark, I was rushing to get in from the cold when Mike paused in the driveway to point out things that captured his imagination. As is often the case, when I stop and look up and see things through my husband's eyes, I too was drawn in, and together we spent several minutes as he excitedly pointed out first a planet that shone brightly in the sky, and then the position and the size of the moon, and finally a couple of constellations. All of this was a very different response than I have when I come home alone. On those nights, I rush to the door without ever looking up, and the only hint of wonder I feel is my wonder whether or not I might drop something. Perhaps it would serve me well to follow Mike's example of pausing to experience curiosity and awe. You see, Dr. Keltner writes that awe offers tremendous health benefits that include calming us down and triggering the release of oxytocin, the hormone that promotes trust and bonding. It activates the vagal nerves that slow down our heart rates, relieve digestion, and deepen breathing. Awe can also quiet the inner critic, the voice in our heads that tells us that we're not enough, not smart or beautiful or rich enough. Keltner notes that in this age of social media, we need awe to get us out of our own cycles of narcissism and entitlement, of self-shame and criticism that this culture creates, and instead help us to see our place in the larger context of our communities. It's interesting, I think, that a thread of awe and joy runs through the beginning of Luke's gospel as we see examples repeated throughout the first chapter of the text. Not only are the neighbors of the Judean hill country amazed at John's birth in our reading today, but we can imagine Zechariah's wonder and awe when his voice finally returns as soon as his son is born. Next week, we'll retell of the joy and excitement everyone in Bethlehem experienced as the shepherds share the good news of Jesus' birth. In fact, the entire birth narrative is full of joy, wonder, and amazement. Perhaps this is why the story is so beloved. As Zechariah rejoices at the birth of his son and the return of his voice, as the angels share in their tidings of joy, perhaps we find ourselves hoping that if we too thank God and pass our blessings on to others, we might be filled with wonder, excitement, and amazement. My visit with Shayna, Scott, and Layla filled me with awe at the love that they share in their special family. As my husband caused me to pause and notice the vast gifts in the night sky, I was filled again with wonder. What have you noticed recently that has amazed you? Can you call things out where you have found amazement recently? I'm sorry? The moon? Yes, the moon has been beautiful. Others? Perhaps this is a sign that in the coming week, as we enter our final preparations for the coming of the Messiah, the Prince of Peace, that we all need to slow down, to find moments to pause, to be alert, engaged, and ready to respond in love to the wonder and amazement that surrounds us every single day. May it be so. Amen.